A single sickening snap of my mother's cane was all it took to dismantle a corrupt empire. I spent a decade in the high-stakes boardroom, but nothing prepared me for the war I started when I decided to burn their entire organized scheme to the ground. I still remember the sound. It wasn't a loud crack, but a sickening, hollow snap. The sound of seasoned oak splintering under the weight of a man who thought his badge made him a god. My mother, 72 years old, and relying on that cane to navigate the uneven pavement of our neighborhood, didn't even fall. She just stood there, swaying, clutching the jagged, useless stump of wood, while Officer Miller stood over her, his lips curled into that signature, sneering grin that had terrorized our district for years. He had stepped on it intentionally, grinding his heavy tactical boot into the grain until it gave way, all because she had the audacity to move too slowly while crossing the street during his patrol. "Maybe now you'll walk faster, old lady," he spat, not even glancing down as he adjusted his belt. He didn't see the fear in her eyes. He only saw an obstacle. He didn't know who she was, or, more importantly, who she had raised. He climbed back into his cruiser, the heavy door slamming shut with a finality that signaled to everyone on the block that he was untouchable. My mother managed to make it to the bench at the bus stop, her knuckles white, tears streaming silently down her face. She was too proud to call me immediately. She was a woman of the old school. Suffering in silence was her way of protecting me. She didn't know that I had spent the last decade building a world where people like Miller were nothing more than ants under a magnifying glass. I was finishing a high-stakes acquisition meeting in the city's financial district when my phone buzzed with an unrecognizable number. When I answered, I heard only ragged breathing and the distant, muffled sound of police sirens. "Mom?" I stood up, my chair clattering backward, silence instantly falling over the boardroom. "Mom, talk to me." She whispered what happened, the humiliation thick in her voice. She wasn't just hurt. She was broken by the sheer, unprovoked cruelty of it. As she spoke, the professional mask I wore, the calm, calculating investor, melted away, replaced by a cold, searing furnace of rage that I hadn't felt since I was a boy living on the wrong side of the tracks. I didn't shout. I didn't make a scene. I simply told her to stay put and hung up. I walked out of that building and into a different reality. I made one call, then another. I didn't reach out to the police precinct. I knew how that would end. Internal complaints against Miller were discarded like trash, buried under a mountain of bureaucracy. Instead, I called a firm that specializes in digital shadows. Within 45 minutes, I had Miller's entire life on a tablet in my passenger seat. His address, his offshore accounts, the messy divorce, and the organized scheme he had been running out of the back of his cruiser for the past 3 years. He was skimming from local businesses and moving packages with forbidden substances, thinking he was clever enough to hide his tracks from the internal safety department. He was a small man with a big ego, unaware that he had just stepped on the wrong person's support system. I drove to the station, my hands steady on the wheel, my mind calculating every move like a move on a chessboard. I watched from across the street as he clocked out. He looked smug, adjusting his vest, laughing with a partner who looked just as corrupt. He walked toward his personal car, completely oblivious to the fact that his life was about to be dismantled. I didn't want him fired. That was too easy. I wanted him to feel the exact level of helplessness my mother felt. I wanted him to realize that the armor he wore, the badge, the uniform, the perceived immunity, was paper thin. As he reached for his door handle, I pulled my vehicle up behind his, blocking him in. I didn't get out. I waited for him to notice me, for his eyes to lock with mine through the tinted glass. He walked over, his hand resting instinctively on his holster, that same arrogant smirk creeping back onto his face. He leaned down, tapping his knuckles against my window, ready to dish out some fresh intimidation. I rolled the window down just an inch. "You have a nice car, Miller," I said, my voice eerily calm. "It's a shame it's registered to a shell company in the Caymans. I wonder what the Internal Safety Department would think if they saw your recent bank statements." The smirk vanished. His face went pale, then a mottled, angry red. He lunged for the window, his fingers clawing at the frame, but I was faster. I hit the gas and circled the parking lot, forcing him to jog after me, watching him sputter and yell. He was desperate now, his bravado replaced by the frantic panic of a predator suddenly turned prey. He reached for his radio, but I pulled out a burner phone and held it up to the window, showing him a live feed of his own home security system, which I had just hacked. He froze, his hand hovering over his radio, realizing he was trapped. He wasn't just a cop anymore, he was a liability, and in his line of work, liabilities get erased. But just as I prepared to deliver the ultimatum that would ruin him, his partner stepped out of the station, his hand moving toward the illegal weapon tucked into his waistband, signaling that this was no longer a one-on-one confrontation. I looked at the rearview mirror and saw a black sedan creeping into the lot, lights off. My heart stopped. This wasn't just a rogue cop. I had stumbled into something much darker. The black sedan didn't just drift into the lot. It carved a line of authority through the darkness, its headlights off, moving with the predatory silence of a shark. Miller froze, his hand trembling as he realized that the reinforcements arriving weren't there to protect him. They were there to clean up the mess. My blood turned to ice. I had spent years in the high-stakes world of corporate intelligence, navigating back-alley deals and hostile takeovers. But this was different. This was visceral, raw, and dangerous, in a way that spreadsheets and legal briefs never were. I realized with a jolt of horror that Miller wasn't just a corrupt officer. He was a low-level pawn in a much larger, more lethal organized scheme that operated deep within the city's underbelly. I quickly killed my engine and ducked low in the seat, watching the scene unfold through a sliver of the window. The sedan's door opened, and a man in a charcoal gray suit stepped out. Not a uniform in sight, but the way Miller visibly recoiled told me everything I needed to know. This man held the leash. Miller stumbled back, his previous arrogance replaced by a pathetic, cowering posture. He was babbling, pointing toward my car, trying to explain his failure to maintain cover. The man in the suit didn't even acknowledge Miller's pleas. He simply pulled a suppressed firearm from his jacket, a piece of illegal weaponry that had no business being in the hands of anyone but an executioner, and gestured toward my vehicle. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I reached for my phone, fingers flying across the screen to send an encrypted ping to my security detail, but the signal was dead. They had deployed a localized jammer. I was blind, I was trapped, and I was seconds away from becoming a ghost in a parking lot that nobody would ever search. The man in the suit began to walk toward me, his pace measured and agonizingly slow, while Miller stood behind him, looking like a man who realized his life was over the moment the bullet left the chamber. This was no longer about a broken cane or a victimized old woman. I had poked a hornet's nest, and the queen was coming for my head. I looked down at the tablet on my passenger seat, where the decrypted data on Miller's connections still glowed. I saw a file I hadn't opened yet. Operation Ghost Ledger. My curiosity had been my greatest asset in business, but here, it was a death sentence. I scanned the file in the split second I had left, seeing names of city officials, police captains, and high-ranking figures tied into the same network that Miller had been fueling with his small-time, dirty errands. They weren't just moving packages with forbidden substances. They were funding a machine that controlled the pulse of the entire district. The man in the gray suit reached my driver's side door. He didn't knock. He simply stared through the glass, his eyes devoid of anything resembling humanity. He raised the weapon, the silence of the parking lot heavy and suffocating. He tapped the muzzle against the driver's window, a rhythmic, taunting sound. "You're a long way from the boardroom, kid," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the city. He didn't even know my name, yet he knew exactly what I was. He wasn't there to arrest me. He was there to ensure that the information on my tablet stayed buried under 6 feet of earth. I knew that if I stayed, I died. If I ran, I died. I had one desperate, reckless option left. I shifted my car into reverse, ready to slam the accelerator and gamble on a high-speed exit. But then I saw a movement in the distance. The flashing red and blue lights of a patrol cruiser turning into the lot. For a heartbeat, relief flooded through me, but it vanished instantly. The patrol cruiser didn't pull over to help. It stopped, cut its lights, and joined the formation with the black sedan. The Internal Safety Department wasn't coming to my rescue. They were part of the network. The man in the suit pulled the trigger, but the sound was masked by the sudden, deafening roar of a heavy engine from behind me. A large utility truck smashed through the chain-link fence of the lot, headlights blinding the trio, and plowed directly into the black sedan, sending sparks showering across the pavement. In the chaos, I didn't think, I just drove. I floored the pedal, swerving past the carnage, my tires screaming against the asphalt as I wove through the narrow exit. I looked back in the rearview mirror just in time to see the driver of the truck tumble out, not with a badge, but with a look of cold, calculated precision. I was safe for the moment, but as I glanced at my dashboard, a new alert flashed. My home address was currently being accessed by an external, unauthorized IP. My mother was home alone. The nightmare wasn't just following me, it had already reached her door. The engine of my car hummed with a frantic, high-pitched whine as I pushed the speedometer into the red. My knuckles were white, fused to the leather of the steering wheel, and my breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. The alert on my dashboard wasn't just a notification, it was a death warrant. Someone, one of the invisible hands of that organized scheme, was inside my house. I didn't care about the laws of the road, the speed cameras, or the potential for a fatal collision. Every second I lost was another heartbeat of time that my mother didn't have. I took the corners on 2 wheels, the scent of burning rubber filling the cabin, my mind racing through every security protocol I had ever established. My home was a fortress, or at least it was supposed to be. I had invested millions in biometrics, reinforced steel, and a panic room that was designed to withstand a siege. But none of that mattered if they were already inside. As the familiar silhouette of my estate came into view, my blood ran cold. The driveway, usually illuminated by motion-activated floodlights, was plunged into an eerie, unnatural darkness. The power had been cut. I skidded to a halt, the tires spraying gravel across the manicured lawn. I didn't wait for the engine to stop humming before I kicked the door open. I didn't have a weapon, at least not in the traditional sense, but I had the element of surprise and the cold, unadulterated rage of a son who had watched his mother be dehumanized. I reached into the glove box and grabbed the heavy-duty tactical flashlight, a tool I'd kept for emergencies, its beam strong enough to blind a man at 50 yards. I approached the front door, my footsteps silent on the stone path. The heavy mahogany door, a masterpiece of security engineering, stood slightly ajar. My heart sank. They hadn't forced it, they had keyed it. Someone with access codes had walked right in. I pushed the door open, the hinges silent, and stepped into the darkness of the foyer. The house was deathly quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy, pressing against the eardrums. "Mom?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. No answer. I moved through the living room, my pulse thundering in my ears like a war drum. Everything was in its place: the antiques, the art, the memories. But the air felt disturbed, charged with the lingering presence of someone who didn't belong. I reached the hallway leading to the study, and that's when I saw it. A single shattered porcelain vase lay on the floor, a gift from my father. I crept forward, the beam of my light cutting through the shadows, until I reached the entrance to the kitchen. There, standing over the island, was a figure dressed in black, their back to me. They were holding something, turning it over in their hands. I didn't hesitate. I swung the heavy flashlight with every ounce of strength I possessed, aiming for the shoulder. The figure spun, surprisingly agile, and caught my wrist with a grip like a vice. The struggle was brief and brutal. We collided with the cabinets, the sound of glass breaking echoing through the house like gunshots. I managed to shove them backward, and as the moonlight caught their face, I froze. It wasn't one of the goons from the parking lot. It was someone I knew. It was Detective Vance, the man who had supposedly been investigating the precinct's corruption for years. He looked at me, not with the cold gaze of an assassin, but with a look of profound, weary disappointment. He held a small black drive, the backup of everything I had been carrying on my tablet. "You're a genius with numbers, kid," he said, his voice raspy, "but you're playing a game you don't understand." He tossed the drive onto the counter. "You think Miller is the problem? You think this is about a broken cane? You have no idea how deep this goes. You didn't just stumble onto an organized scheme. You've just bypassed the firewall of the city's entire power structure." He took a step toward me, his hands raised in surrender, but his eyes were darting toward the window. "They aren't coming to kill you, at least, not yet. They're coming to offer you a seat at the table. And if you refuse, they aren't going to take your life. They're going to give you a charge, a heavy accusation that will ensure you never see the light of day again." I stared at him, my mind spinning. "Where is my mother?" I demanded, my voice trembling with suppressed fury. Vance looked at the floor, his expression hardening. "She's not here, and she hasn't been since sunset. She's being held as collateral for the data you're currently carrying." Suddenly, the sound of multiple engines echoed outside. Not one car, but a fleet. Blue and red lights began to dance against the walls of my house, synchronized and cold. It wasn't the police. It was a private security force acting under the color of law. Then, a voice boomed from the driveway, amplified by a loudspeaker, echoing with a chilling, formal tone. "Surrender the assets and exit the premises. You are facing a heavy, multifaceted indictment for the illegal acquisition of state-classified information." I looked at the drive, then at the door, then at Vance. I was trapped between an impossible choice and an inevitable, crushing reality. I lunged for the drive, but just as my fingers touched the plastic, a laser sight appeared on my chest, a small red dot glowing like a star. I had 3 seconds to decide my entire future, and the front door blew off its hinges. The force of the door shattering against the hardwood floors sent a shockwave through the house, the sound of the explosion ringing in my ears like a final, definitive bell. Through the swirling dust and splintered wood, I saw them. 3 figures in tactical gear, faces obscured by matte black balaclavas, weapons raised with the fluid, trained precision of a private military unit. They weren't police. The insignias on their tactical vests had been stripped away, replaced by a single, stylized emblem I had only ever seen in the deepest, most encrypted archives of the city's financial dark web. I didn't think. Instinct took over. I dove behind the granite island just as a flurry of non-lethal suppressive fire turned my kitchen into a jagged mosaic of shattered tile and destroyed marble. Detective Vance didn't even flinch. He remained standing by the counter, his hands still raised, watching the scene with a detached, chilling apathy. He was an observer, waiting to see if I would fold under the pressure of the impending, heavy accusation they were so eager to bury me with. "Drop the drive," one of the men barked, his voice distorted by a voice modulator. My heart felt like a cinder block in my chest. If I handed it over, my mother was my only bargaining chip. But I knew how these people operated. Once the assets were recovered, the liability would be erased. I gripped the drive so hard the plastic dug into my palm. I looked at the floor, catching a glimpse of a floor vent I had installed months ago as part of the home's reinforced panic grid. It was my only way out. With a desperate shove, I kicked the vent cover aside and scrambled into the crawl space, the dark, cramped air smelling of dust and ozone. Bullets chewed through the wood of the floor above me, sending splinters showering down like shrapnel. I didn't stop crawling. I scrambled through the narrow, pitch-black conduit, the sound of heavy boots thudding on the floorboards directly over my head. They were hunting me like a rat in a tunnel. I reached the secondary access point, which led to the basement, and slid down the chute, landing hard on the concrete floor. I was in the server room, the heart of my digital world. I scrambled to the terminal, my fingers dancing across the keys, initiating the dead man switch I had programmed a year ago. It wasn't a weapon, and it wasn't a defense against the men upstairs. It was a broadcast. If I didn't enter a code every 12 hours, the server would automatically upload every piece of data regarding the organized scheme, the bank accounts, the names of the corrupt officials, and the evidence of the forbidden substances to every major news outlet and regulatory agency in the country. I typed the command, my hands shaking so violently I almost mistyped the key. Uploading encrypted package. Agreements of the light from the imprint of the server history may hand for upload to the Equal Devencit Crease. Progress bar appeared. 1%, 5%, 10%. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered and died. The hum of the servers, usually a comforting, constant sound, stuttered and then fell into a terrifying silence. The system had been hacked from the outside. They weren't just physically hunting me, they were dismantling my digital shield. The monitor glowed with a new message, typed out in a cold, clean font. "Stop, or we will end her." A video file opened on the screen. The image was grainy, illuminated by the harsh light of a single flickering bulb. My mother was sitting in a chair, her hands tied behind her back, her face pale but her eyes burning with a defiance that reminded me exactly why I was the man I was. She looked straight into the camera, not at the person filming, but at me. She whispered something, her voice barely a breath. "Don't you dare give them a thing, Elias. They are nothing but ghosts. Let them burn." A heavy hand landed on my shoulder. I didn't need to turn around to know it was Vance. He had bypassed the kitchen and descended the stairs with a terrifying, silent grace. He leaned down, his mouth inches from my ear, his breath smelling of stale coffee and cheap tobacco. "She's a brave woman, Elias. It's a pity her bravery is going to cost her everything. You think you're the hero in this story? You're just a glitch in the system, and the system has a very efficient way of patching glitches." He grabbed my hair and forced my head down, pressing my face toward the glowing, dying screen. The progress bar for the upload had stalled at 88%. The men in tactical gear stepped into the basement, their weapons aimed squarely at the back of my head. "The choice is yours," Vance whispered, pulling a small silver device from his pocket, a remote detonator. "Give us the encryption keys to the full, unredacted cache, or we make sure that your mother's final moments are as quiet and forgotten as this basement." He clicked the device. A high-pitched, agonizing whine emanated from the walls, a frequency that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. It was a sonic weapon, designed to incapacitate without leaving a mark. I fell to my knees, my grip on the desk failing. As my consciousness began to spiral into the abyss, I saw the men in masks start to dismantle my server rack, piece by piece. But just as the world began to go black, a sharp, rhythmic tapping echoed from behind the concrete wall of the server room, a sound I hadn't heard since I was a child. It was the signal from my father's old associate, a man the police thought had been dead for 20 years. The wall began to shift, and for the first time, I realized that I wasn't the only one who had been planning for this war. The rhythmic tapping against the reinforced concrete wasn't just a sound, it was a ghost returning from the grave. As the wall shuddered and a slab of solid masonry began to pivot outward, the men in tactical gear froze, their weapons swinging toward the movement. The sonic whine filling the room reached a fever pitch, but then, with a sharp clack, the frequency dropped into absolute silence. A flashbang grenade rolled out from the opening, but it wasn't the kind the tactical team used. It released a thick, obsidian-colored smoke that choked the room, neutralizing the laser sights of their weapons and turning the basement into a chaotic, shifting void. I didn't wait. Using the cover of the smoke, I threw my weight against Vance, driving my shoulder into his chest and knocking the remote detonator from his hand. It skidded across the floor and vanished into the darkness. I didn't care about the drive anymore. I cared about the exit. Through the gaping hole in the wall emerged a figure draped in shadows, moving with a familiar, lethal economy of motion. It was Marcus, my father's former head of security, a man who had vanished the day my family's life was dismantled by that same organized scheme decades ago. He didn't say a word. He simply shoved a rugged, encrypted satellite phone into my hand and pulled me through the breach. We moved through a tunnel that clearly hadn't been on any blueprints, a forgotten artery of the city's ancient infrastructure. "They have your mother at the industrial shipyard, District 4, Marcus whispered, his voice as rough as grinding stones. "The internal safety department is leading the transfer. We have exactly 20 minutes before they move her to an off-site black zone. If she leaves that yard, we never see her again." I didn't ask questions. I didn't even wonder how he knew. I trusted him with the only thing I had left, my future. As we emerged into the cold night air behind a derelict warehouse, a vehicle was waiting, a plain, unmarked van that blended perfectly into the urban decay. I climbed in and Marcus floored it, the engine roaring as we tore through the back streets. While we drove, I opened the encrypted phone. It was already synced to the data I had been carrying. I didn't try to upload it to the news stations anymore. I targeted the one place that would cause an immediate, catastrophic, systemic collapse. I bypassed the news and sent the entire, unredacted cache, including the real identities of the politicians and the location of every illegal shipment, directly to the primary server of the National Oversight Committee and the Internal Investigation Board simultaneously. By the time we screeched to a halt at the shipyard, the sirens were already wailing in the distance. Not the corrupt local patrol, but federal response teams moving in with a mandate that couldn't be ignored. The shipyard was a labyrinth of shipping containers and flickering lights. I saw Miller, the arrogant cop who started this, standing by a sedan, his face pale, frantically talking into his radio. He looked like a man who realized his world was crumbling. I didn't wait for Marcus. I sprinted toward the center of the yard, where a black SUV sat idling, my mother visible through the rear window. She was alive. She was fighting, kicking against the man holding her, and that sight gave me a strength I didn't know I possessed. I slammed my body into the guard standing by the door, and for a moment, the yard erupted into a blur of motion. The federal teams breached the main gate, their searchlights cutting through the night like the judgment of a higher power. Miller panicked, trying to scramble into his car, but he was intercepted by a wall of agents. I grabbed the door handle, yanked it open, and pulled my mother to safety, shielding her with my own body as shots rang out, the desperate, pathetic final stand of men who knew their cover had been blown forever. The organized scheme was being dismantled in real time, the light of the truth shining into every dark corner where they had operated for so long. 2 hours later, the yard was a scene of total arrest. The man in the gray suit, the one who had tried to execute me in the parking lot, was being dragged away in chains, his face twisted in a mask of defeat. Miller was on his knees, begging for a deal that no one was willing to give. I sat on the back of an ambulance, a blanket around my mother's shoulders, watching the city wake up to the news that would define the next decade of its history. The heavy accusation they had prepared for me never came. Instead, the evidence I provided was so overwhelming that the federal prosecutors had no choice but to offer me protection. The network that had controlled our lives was officially dead. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting a long, golden light over the broken containers and the quiet, empty shipyard, my mother reached out and squeezed my hand. Her cane was gone, shattered back in our driveway, but as she leaned on me to stand, she didn't look like a woman who needed a crutch. She looked like a woman who had finally been set free. The arrogant cop and his masters had bet on our silence, assuming that a grandmother and a businessman were easy targets for their cruelty. They forgot one thing. Power isn't just about badges or guns or influence. It's about the people you fight for. As we walked toward the police perimeter, I looked back one last time at the wreckage of their empire. The case was closed, the monsters were in cages, and for the first time in years, the city felt like a place where a person could walk home without looking over their shoulder. The storm had passed, and we were still standing.